Hello, I'm Janhavi Prasada, bringing a fascinating speaker on my podcast, Abbotsford Dialogue. This is the first episode that we are going into with a wonderful guest who hails from Kiama, New South Wales, Australia, Mr. Darcy Moore. Darcy is an independent scholar and he's researching George Orwell and writing a book, Orwell in Paris. Barack Obama follows Darcy on Twitter, and Amitav Ghosh's latest book, Smoke and Ashes, has been blurbed by Darcy as well. So we know where he's coming from. He's come to stay with us at Abbotsford, which is my heritage home. Indeed, a pleasure to have you stay with us, Darcy. Let's dive into the conversation as you unpack your sort of story and revelations about George Orwell. I'm not going to speak much what those revelations are because you are here in front of us to tell us that. So my first question really is, there's so many authors and literary giants from Orwell's time, be it Oscar Wilde or George Eliot, James Joyce. Why did you pick on Orwell for your research topic? What inspired you? What was the spark really? Where did it all begin?
I think Janhavi, like many of the young people who were educated in Nainital at the local schools, I read Animal Farm when I was around about 15 years of age. And then shortly after that, I read 1984, and I read 1984 in 1984. And I remember very vividly, I had to catch a train to see my cousin in the city, in Sydney. And I had this book from school to read, and I read it on a lengthy train trip, and I finished it. And then on the way back, I reread it. And, that was a long time ago now. But since then, I've always been enamored with Orwell. I don't know how to answer your question specifically as to why, but at university, if I walked into a secondhand bookshop in the city that I lived, I would just look for secondhand copies of his work. And at that time, I didn't really know anything about the context of his life. I just liked his writing, and I loved his essays. They just seemed to speak directly to me. And it's that clear, direct prose that I think
Was it the language that enticed you to further read on, or was it his the ideas behind it, the thought that went behind his ideas into writing? Where were you at that time in your mind space that connected you to Orwell?
I think I must have really liked the writing without thinking about the writing. So if I read Homage to Catalonia, I liked the story that he was telling, but I wasn't doing much in the way of analysis of that. It was just purely enjoying what he had to say. And every time I picked up a new book, it spoke to me in some way, shape or form. And of course, at this time, I've always been an avid reader, so I'm reading lots and lots and lots of things. But it got to the stage probably 6 or 7 years ago where I just read everything that Orwell had written, including his letters and essays and film and theatre reviews. And at that point, I wanted to find out more. And there were these big gaps and silences in his life. So I started to research that period, really, of Orwell before he was Orwell. So in 1933, January 1933, he published Down and Out in Paris and London. And that's when we first hear the name George Orwell. But I really wanted to know about the period before the publication of that particular work.
Wonderful. We both have something in common. You have George Orwell, I have Gandhi. And how I discovered Gandhi was in similar circumstances. I tried to read Gandhi's autobiography when I was 12 or 13, and I threw it away because it went above my head. And then when I was about 19, 20, I again went back to it. And then I could pick out and identify a lot of ideas and ideals and experiments that he went with as a child, as an adolescent, as a young barrister, and then much older in life. And each stage of his life was a revelation for me, because we in India are conditioned to know Gandhi in a particular way, that he was the father of the nation and he gave us independence, and he was the most pious man, a spiritual leader. That these are the two, three things that we are told in school. But that autobiography, after reading it, it was like a revelation where I said, my God, this man, his character is so scarred, yet he is so great. And that's how my journey into Gandhi started. But coming back to George Orwell, why are you here? Why are you in Nainital? Why have you crossed seven seas and reached Nainital at Abbotsford with us?
It's interesting what you say about Gandhi, because I've always, the last few years, I've made the jest that Orwell is not the guy that your English teacher told you he was. And I think that's similar to what you're saying about Gandhi. You knew a little bit, but as you started to look further, there was so much more. And with Orwell, there are certainly controversies in the story of Orwell. Just before he died, he requested that no biography was to be written of him. So by the time one was written, almost 30 years after his death, the trail was really cold. You know, a lot of people had passed. So for me, I've been spending quite a lot of time visiting places. I've been to Paris several times because he lived there in 1928 and 1929. But what became increasingly interesting to me was Orwell's Anglo-Indian heritage. And what I mean by Anglo-Indian in this context is that both sides of his family had spent a great deal of time going back generations on the subcontinent, both in Lulmay, Burma, but also in India. So his father was a sub-deputy opium agent, so a servant of empire, and he did that job for 37 years. And to answer your question, Richard Blair, Orwell's father, married Ida Lamuzin here in Nainital on the 15th of June 1897 at St John's in the Wilderness. That magnificent church, which when you look at a photo online, you have no idea that it's closer to a cathedral than a church. And considering it was, you know, the construction began in 1844, and so early in the history of Naini, the European history of Naini, that I wanted to come here to find out a little bit more. Now, Ida, it appears from Thacker's directory, it appears that she lived at Fern Cottage. So I'd done some research, some primary sources were available online, but I wanted to come to Naini to try to find out what the local people knew. And I have been extremely lucky. I've been to Fern Cottage with Alok Shah, who sat with me today looking through municipal records to try to work out the history of ownership. Since I've been in Naini, I've discovered all of these other wonderfully interesting things to do with Ida. With it, when I was looking at Fern Cottage, I'd been lucky enough to be staying at Gurney House, which was Jim Corbett's family home. Now, I have to be honest here, Janhavi, I had never heard of Jim Corbett, and my plane didn't turn up at Delhi airport, so myself and several young Indian people, well educated, in their 20s, we travelled here via taxi. And I'll digress further to say that one of the young women actually attended the school that I believe that Ida, Orwell's mother, taught at, All Saints. And another thing is, she told me when she was at All Saints, guess which novel she'd studied? Animal Farm. What a coincidence. I think there's over 1 billion people.
Wonderful, wonderful.
With a young woman who had read Animal Farm and attended the school where I believe it's most likely that her mother taught. So as I started to dig deeper and to dive into this story, it appears that Jim Corbett's mother was a really significant woman on a number of levels, but for European visitors.
Yeah, she was one of the first women entrepreneurs that we had at that time, and she was the top property agent. So whoever came into town had to go by her to figure out where they wanted to stay, which house did they wanted to be allotted.
So I knew nothing of Jim Corbett, and as we're driving north, I suddenly see Jim Corbett restaurants, Jim Corbett hotels, Jim Corbett, of course, the wonderful national park. So for me, this is interesting. But at this stage, I don't, it's just an interesting thing because I'm travelling somewhere else in the world. But as I started to walk from Gurney House, where Jim Corbett and his family lived, I started to realise how close Fern Cottage was. And I thought it's only 6 or 7 minute walks. That's interesting. I wonder if they knew each other. And then I discovered that the post office, until I think about 1899, 1900, was what is now known as the Hive Cottage. And I think, the post office is going to be a very important part of everyone's life.
Absolutely.
And then I discovered that Jim Corbett's father and his brother are the postmasters there. Then I discover that his sister, Maggie, is on the board of governance at All Saints. So suddenly a story starts to develop that is possible, and that is that Ida, and I should point out that Ida marries in 1897 here, and the Thacker's Directory says, Miss Limousin, first teacher, girls' school, Fern Cottage. Now, it would be conceivable that it was another one of her sisters, but that seems extremely unlikely considering that she married here. She did have another sister who taught at a diocesan school in Rangoon, and I believe that sister travelled here as well for the wedding. So, I'm still looking for more evidence to pin this down. And to anyone listening to this podcast, if you have connections with anyone who has records from 1895, 1896, 1897, and 1898, primary sources, diaries, anything that mentions Ida, so it's IDA, and her surname is Limouzin, who married Richard Blair, as I mentioned, in June of 1897, I would be very appreciative if you could get in contact with me.
Surely, we'll do that once the podcast is up on various platforms. Coming back to Orwell again, I got to know that George Orwell is his pen name. Any story behind that?
There's a number of stories. And knowing exactly why is not clear. However, the correspondence between his literary agent and himself in the lead up to the publication of Down Out in Paris and London is he had several options, pen names. And with it, he said, I think I prefer George Orwell. Now, there is a river Orwell, which runs through Suffolk, and he lived close by. There is also some interesting things about the name George. He had an uncle, one of Ida's brothers, whose name was George Limousin. And interestingly enough, he really admired George. George, very much unknown to Orwell scholars and people who are very interested in Orwell, George served in the Indian Imperial Police around about 1900, 1901, 1902. So, and he was a very interesting man. He, I believe, he met Gandhi, George Limousin, Orwell's uncle. He certainly was a pilot. He fought in the First World War. He was in the South African Air Service, but he's also fought on the Western Front, and you can find his records with the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps, I believe it was called at the time.
Great. Um, One very important aspect of George Orwell is his attitude towards imperialism. We all know he was totally anti imperialistic, coming from and serving in the Indian Imperial Police in Burma, coming from a family of Anglo Indians who were meant to sort of rule over the slaves, especially from where I come during the British Raj. So I wanted to know where did he get that fire in his belly, where he sort of detested the whole idea of suppressing anyone, any, it could be any man, woman, race, any any profession. He had that sensitive and that soft side to him, and his writings bring that out. Especially the latest book that I've read is The Burmese Days. It's a fantastic book. Um, where does he get that? Is this something which shaped his character as he was a child during his growing up days? Where did this come from? Considering he was born in 1903 and he left India within a year of his birth in Motihari. And he came back to Burma after 19 years. So he did not have really a sort of an experience of being in these parts where the imperial services were ruling the roost. So where did he get this instinct really?
The conventional story is that Orwell wrote in the second half of The Road to Wigan Pier, which is published in 1937. He wrote that people probably couldn't understand how much he detested the imperialism he was serving. Now, he says that 10 years after he resigned from the Indian Imperial Police. But Orwell, he's in many ways controlled his own story. I mean, we've already talked about he didn't want a biography written. So to actually pinpoint when he really becomes a fervent anti-imperialist, it's not as simple as it seems. So why did he resign from the Indian Imperial Police? Well, why did he do that on the 1st of January 1928? There's a whole lot of speculation, and with it, I personally think that the evidence is leading towards him wanting to actually marry. When he came back from Burma, he had an engagement ring, and he went to propose marriage to Jacinta Burikam, a childhood friend of his. Now, it's a very complex story. But quite simply, when he arrived back, she already had a child out of wedlock. And once again, the conventional story is that he doesn't know about that he never knew about that. But when you're reading Burmese Days, you would have noted that the protagonist, John Flory, he believes that he can live in Burma if he has a companion, a wife who shares, his love of books and interest in the culture. And it seems to be the case that when Orwell left in July 1927, he travels to Paris. He meets with his Aunt Nellie, who is living with an Esperantist. So you might know of the constructed language Esperanto. And the guy that she was living with, Eugene Adam, his pseudonym was Lanty. So when he arrived, his aunt was writing with a pseudonym in Esperanto, E.K.L., which was her initials, Ellen Kate Lemurzen. She was living with a guy who was pumping out essentially some really radical thoughts about a nationalism. Should we have countries where He served during the First World War, so he knew that countries tend to talk their citizens into fighting other countries. So very, very political. Later on, it's clear that Orwell doesn't have much respect for Esperanto, but for those who have read 1984, that there is lots of indications that this constructed language has been conceived by Orwell partly. You can even hear in the name, new speak. Esperanto is a new speak. It's once again more complex than that. But he's in Paris. He travels to Shropshire and he wishes to propose marriage, but the woman is not there, and he never marries her. And they meet again. Well, they don't meet, they correspond just before he dies. And that's also another interesting story in itself. But the reality is that he hadn't decided that he was going to resign when he left. And a recent review of Douglas Kerr's book, Orwell and Empire, said that biographers don't really know why he resigned. And reading history backwards suggests, he's just an anti-imperialist. I think there's personal reasons which are much more complex.
The little that I've read, I read his graphic novel, which talks about his school days and how he was traumatized in that first phase of his life onto Eton, where he noticed so much of racism and classism. I think at a human level also he understood how people are to be treated in life, and he was just a good man who wanted to treat everybody on an equal platform, and his calling was not the imperial services.
Yeah, I think it's, he says it was a career he was not suited for, but there are many people who do careers they're not suited for. It would have been a massive disappointment to his family because they'd invested, they didn't educate the two sisters, they educated their son. And with it, theoretically, he could have worked his way through the civil service to be, a high-ranking servant of empire. And his father had served for, I think it was 37 years, from 1875 to his retirement in 1912. So his father had committed to that lifestyle. And when he comes back, they go down to Cornwall and he announces to his family, I'm going to become a writer. It didn't go down very well. And interestingly enough, in 1939, when his father passes away, his father read a review in a significant newspaper of Orwell's novel coming up for air. And with it, his father saw that his son had become a successful writer. And I think that was a significant moment in both of their lives as his father passed away from a particularly nasty cancer.
The story. Coming to Anna Funder, we've discussed her critique on Orwell earlier. It's a different aspect that she's sort of opened up in my head, the role of women in Orwell's lives. So can you throw some light on that? How was his relationship with his mother, with his sisters, especially the wives?
So Orwell was married twice. His first wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, very tragically died on the operating table just literally months after they had adopted a child, Richard. And with it, the very tragic story, Orwell was working as a war correspondent in Germany. He came back and basically she had died whilst having a hysterectomy. With it, he did marry a second time, but it was rather macabre. It was on literally on his deathbed late in 1949. He married a much younger, very beautiful woman, Sonia Brownhill, and she became the person who ran his literary estate. And she did that for many years. And as I mentioned, she carried out his wishes and that there was to be no biography. But the significant women in Orwell's life have been underrepresented in all kinds of ways. So, for example, I mentioned his Aunt Nellie Ramusin. She was an actress. She was a suffragette. She was somebody who worked for freelancing for Oxford University Press. She was somebody who chained herself to the rails and was imprisoned for her beliefs in freedom for women. She lived in Paris. She was an Esperantist, but young Eric Blair, he would come from Eton and would visit her, and she knew a lot of significant writers, and you could find many of her letters to the editor in all kinds of journals and newspapers. So we haven't got much of their correspondence, but we know that she was just an advocate for him. I found letters written in Esperanto where she is talking to one of her Esperantist friends in 1949 and saying, well, the French edition of 1984 will come out shortly. Make sure you hawk it around to the bookshops. So she was a great advocate for her nephew.
What about the poem that she wrote, which was titled 1984?
So
People claim that she wrote it 14 years before George Orwell wrote his.
So there's been much. So Enna Funda wrote Wifedom, which is a blend of biography, memoir. It's creative non-fiction. It's an unusual text. With it, Sylvia Top wrote a biography of Eileen O'Shaughnessy, which was, I think, published in 2020. Which was a more traditional biography. Both of them have pointed out that this poem could have been part of the inspiration for 1984. We don't know for a fact that Orwell knew about it. However, I suspect he did. If you go, we don't have much in the way of Orwell's manuscripts, but we do have 2/3 of 1984, and you can actually see in the manuscript that he has crossed out the date 1982 in later versions of it and replaced, in fact, 1980, then 1982, and then 1984. So there's textual evidence to suggest that it's coincidental and that he was just choosing a date. And as he aged, he changed the date. So with it, it's very interesting. And all of the biographers recognise that Eileen O'Shaughnessy absolutely fundamentally important influence and support for George Orwell. Herself very talented. She went to Oxford University. I believe at one stage one of her tutors was J.R.R. Tolkien. So yeah, she's one of Orwell's. The girlfriend he had before, when he met Eileen, she talked about how perfect Eileen was for George. So it's a very large area to unpack, but there's a stack of really significant women. Ruth Pitter, who was the first female poet to be awarded the Queen's Medal. That was in the 1850s. She was a significant figure in helping him find accommodation in London, but she looked at his first writings and she was cruel. She said it herself. She just thought, this foolish young man has thrown away a career, like a good career in the Burmese police, to become a writer. He's never going to become a writer. And she was at his funeral in 1950 and she wrote a letter to a friend saying how deeply affected she was. But she spoke on the BBC about him and she said he made himself into a master of English prose. He was persistent and he just did what she would have thought was impossible from where he started. So I guess it encourages all of us that, Orwell wrote so much. He wrote and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote. And I think that this belief that writers are born is problematic. I think it's about hard work. It's about writing, rewriting, writing.
Do you think his writings are still relevant today, considering the way the governments are going, there's so much of disparity, economic disparity going around, there's class consciousness, there's racism, there's still, those things are still there. Governments have their own agendas, propagandists are doing their bit. Do you think it's further worsened from the time that Orwell wrote his books?
Well, if we think about the period of time that Orwell lived, one of the reasons why he's still so widely read is it seems like he was everywhere. He's in the 1920s where we have this, we have this period of time in Paris, which was so exciting. He serves as a policeman, serving empire. He's at Eton. He fights in the Spanish Civil War. He's living in London during the Blitz. I mean, his own life is one of incredible challenge just because of the period of time that he lived in between the wars. After the war, one of the reasons why he moved to Jura in the Scottish Hebrides was because he felt it was inevitable an atomic bomb would be dropped on London, and he wanted his son, his adopted son, to not be in that environment. So what's the definition of a classic? I think it's some books that people continue to read, and people continue to read. We know that when Donald Trump was elected, that 1984 shot to the top of the Amazon charts because one of Trump's advisors talked about alternative facts, which of course made people think about 1984 and doublethink, etc. So it's the writing, it's the writing. There's just something special about the way he connects so directly to the reader, whatever his topic is. And there's a fair bit of doublethink in his own work. Is Down and Out in Paris and London, is that non-fiction? Is it fiction? He called it a travelogue, but as I've researched it further, he changed a lot of things in that, as all writers do. So lots of his work, it doesn't fit neatly into a category. Is Shooting an Elephant a personal essay, a short story? Well, it's all those things at once. I think all great writers defy categorization. And so to answer your question, yes.
He is relevant, of course. I mean, when I read the Burmese Days, I mean, the language is just beautiful. The humor is there in spite of the seriousness behind it. So there are layers after layers after layers in his writing. And I'm going to be rereading that book again. So it's wonderful. I think we're a little short of time, but one last question, which is really important, which is to do with Gandhi and Orwell. The two never met. Gandhi, I was doing a bit of my research. I could not find anything that Gandhi had to say about Orwell, but it was the other way round. What did strike me was that Orwell was sort of doubtful about Gandhi, the way he was going about his business, getting independence for India. And he considered him, in quotations, as an irritable, suspicious kind of a man. What sort of instigated these kinds of doubts within Orwell towards Gandhi?
I think that there's these strange parallels between the men. I mean, Orwell's own asceticism is often commented upon. So stubborn, and did lots of things in his life which were just not comfortable, and he could have been much more comfortable. He's often described his physical appearance, and of course he was very debilitated from tuberculosis in the last 5 or 6 years of his life. But he's always described in terms, he's gaunt, the lines on his face are etched. So he knew about suffering, and he put himself in circumstances as he tramped about to get experience about the down and outs. So there's that level. But he also is somebody who is challenging convention, like Gandhi challenges convention. Why does he feel suspicious of Gandhi? It's quite simply to do, in my opinion, with the fact that non-secular belief was a problem for him. So I think that famous essay written in 1949, Reflections on Gandhi, was published in Partisan Review, which is a left-wing American journal which lasted for a very long period of time. It originally started off as a communist journal, then it became much more social democratic, but it was a broad church of people who had left-wing views. So he's publishing it in that context, which I think is important. But that essay I find remarkably positive about Gandhi because Orwell's own Anglo-Indian background, his experience in India, his mindset would always have been suspicious of someone who had the belief system. But it is fascinating that he points out that Gandhi could have lived a very happy, regular, successful life in a number of areas. And I think it's that challenge of going, well, essentially he's a politician and he's a skillful politician and he's somebody that the British Empire perhaps thought they could control. And it suited them, same with many wealthy Indian figures, to have somebody who wasn't a socialist, who wasn't a communist, and was against violence. So ultimately, I think that they were outsmarted by Gandhi.
I think the power of Gandhi, according to me, is really that he acted as some sort of a catalyst for Orwell to express his thoughts. And that is the power of Gandhi. And that is not just with Orwell. Gandhi does that with a community at large, all the critics, all the thinkers, all the intellectuals. He makes you think in different directions about his life and times. And I think that's the wonder of Gandhi, really.
There is another parallel. My understanding of Gandhi is that he treated people in a way that was respectful, regardless of class, caste, religion. And one of Orwell's things was very much about this as well. And I think that that resounds with people, the idea of someone who treats other people in that even-handed way. So, yeah, lots of interesting parallels and contrasts with
Yeah.
these two men.
Yeah. On that wonderful note, Darcy Moore, thank you so much for being on this podcast, the Abbotsford Dialogue, as the first episode for us. So it's really special. Thank you once again.
It's been very special for me as well, being in Nainital and being here at Abbotsford. It's just absolutely glorious.
Thanks for watching me at Abbotsford Dialogues, where I bring an interesting array of speakers who visit Abbotsford in the foothill of the Himalayas. They share their lives, their quests, and their journeys with me. So stay tuned in for more to come. Thank you.